Welcome to today's Indonesia webinar. My name is Jörn Dosch. I'm project leader for the evaluation department's work producing country evaluation briefs. The department has been producing such country evaluation briefs, or CEBs, since 2016. The CEBs are synthesis studies based on existing evaluations of the international development assistance to Norway's partner countries. The purpose is to present systematically collected knowledge about this assistance in an accessible and user-friendly form to its intended users in the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, at embassies, and in Norad. All the CEBs are available at norad.no/CEB. The evaluation department has now produced 17 CEBs with accompanying evaluation portraits consisting of short summaries of the evaluations underlying each CEB, including links to these evaluation reports. Today, we will present and discuss the main findings of the CEB for Indonesia. With us today, we have 3 contributors with in-depth knowledge about developments in Indonesia. They will be introduced to you in a moment. In the first part of today's webinar, each of our 3 contributors will present their perspectives on the development support to Indonesia and the challenges currently facing the country, followed by a dialogue during the latter half of the webinar. I now have the pleasure of handing over to Eva Bratholm, who will lead us through today's meeting and moderate the conversation during the latter half of today's program. Eva is an experienced journalist and formerly led Norad's communications department. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Our first speaker today is Jörn Dosch, who is now in Rostock. Nice to see you. Jörn has written the country evaluation brief on Indonesia on behalf of Particip, the evaluation department consultant for this assignment. Jörn has in-depth knowledge and understanding about development challenges in Indonesia and about the cooperation with various donors to Indonesia. In a moment, he will present to us the main evaluation findings of the Indonesia CEB. Jörn, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Please, the floor is yours.
In this short video, I will summarize some of the main findings and conclusions of the country evaluation brief Indonesia. The report draws on findings presented in 27 evaluations and reviews published since 2013 of major donor-funded interventions in Indonesia. Indonesia is a middle-income country and placed within the category of high human development. Over the last decade, the proportion of the population living below the national poverty line has decreased markedly, from 14.2% to 9.2%. At the same time, however, income inequality has grown at a fast pace. Over 90% of Indonesia's population is exposed to risks of natural disasters. The country is also extremely vulnerable to climate change, and Indonesia is the 3rd largest emitter of carbon dioxide. Since achieving the status of a lower middle-income country in 2003, Indonesia has become less and less dependent on foreign aid. ODA as a percentage of gross national income dropped from almost 1% in 2005 to just 0.024% in 2017. During the period under review, donors have mainly provided assistance in the fields of governance, economic infrastructure, environment and climate resilience, human development, gender and access to justice. Governance-focused programs were successful in making key contributions to the design and implementation of the national decentralization framework. The support also empowered provincial and district governments to plan and budget for pro-poor service delivery. In this regard, the support has been sustainable because the government has exerted strong ownership over decentralization, public financial management reforms, and related policy reforms. This is all unlikely to be reversed. However, while ODA strengthened the framework conditions, few programs directly resulted in sustained improvements to actual service delivery, especially at the local level. Infrastructure development has been a main area of support in recent years. This has been in line with the priorities of Indonesia's current national long-term development plan. But infrastructure bottlenecks coupled with a poor business environment are one of the main challenges in accelerating Indonesia's economic growth. While Indonesia's development partners have tried to address these problems, almost every evaluation report highlights the often substantial hurdles involved in implementing infrastructure projects. Interventions in the environment and climate change sector produced mixed results. On the positive side, donors effectively assisted Indonesia in meeting its obligations under international treaties. Donor support also made some contributions to the implementation of the RED+ framework to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Last but not least, several major programs helped rural coastal communities that are particularly prone to climate change to adapt their livelihoods to new conditions. At the same time, donor support has achieved little in changing Indonesia's position within the top 5 of the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gases. The vast majority of programs in the sample included gender as a cross-cutting issue, and several interventions had a direct gender focus. Evaluations showed mixed degrees of effectiveness. One of the shortcomings was that several interventions lacked specific targets and indicators for gender equality. A good number of projects contributed to women's empowerment in general terms, but there is little evidence of a reduction in gender-based violence and better access to justice for survivors. Most of the sample interventions related to human development were implemented in the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector, or WASH for short. There can be no doubt that major support provided, for example, by UNICEF, Australia, and the Netherlands, improved access to water and sanitation for substantial parts of the population. However, 29 million Indonesians still lack safe water, and 71 million do not have access to improved sanitation facilities. For the past 20 years, Indonesia has laid great emphasis on overhauling the judicial system as a key contribution to the human rights agenda. The donor community has actively and effectively supported this process. While disaster response and prevention was not a major focus of donor support, foreign assistance has been provided to the National Disaster Management Authority. It can generally be concluded that at least partly due to donor support, Indonesia's overall institutional disaster management system has gradually improved as natural disasters have occurred in Indonesia. When we look at the lessons, we find on the positive side that donors generally closely aligned their support with national reform programs and development agendas. State and non-state actors alike demonstrated high levels of ownership. Most evaluations conclude that in particular interventions to strengthen and consolidate the process of decentralization and to empower subnational levels of decision-making have been effective. Especially the community-driven development approach of many projects was a cost-effective way of building both the physical and socio-economic infrastructure at village level. As far as weaknesses are concerned, many effective interventions operated only in small parts of the country, and they were not expanded to and replicated in other provinces, districts, or communities facing the same or similar challenges. Several evaluations refer to the lack of scaling up as a missed opportunity. Several reports point to a shortcoming that also reflects a very common criticism in the assessment of development cooperation in general terms. There's a weakness in and often a lack of monitoring systems that are based on well-elaborated success indicators. The frequent unavailability of baseline studies is a related problem. Some interventions lack defined specific targets for gender equality, as I've already mentioned. Often, other weaknesses were largely outside the control of donors. An often noted example is a lack of coordination between national, regional, and local planning levels as a factor that negatively affected project implementation. When we look at gaps, we also need to keep in mind that the available evaluation reports are not fully representative of the entire spectrum and range of development cooperation with Indonesia. Some major programs have not yet been evaluated or reports are not available. This applies especially to the area of climate change and adaptation. Indonesia is a G20 member and expected to achieve higher middle income status within the next half decade. Indonesia is therefore no longer a main recipient of aid. Many, but not all, of Indonesia's partners have phased out traditional development cooperation and replaced it with new partnership agreements with a strong focus on trade and investment relations. Major investments which overstretch the possibilities of aid are required to reduce deforestation in Indonesia, building a modern economic infrastructure, meeting the enormous and growing need for electric power, and building up the capacity for renewable energy. Reversing the trend of rapidly increasing socioeconomic inequalities is another major challenge. For the time being, development efforts are also likely to be negatively affected by the COVID-19 crisis, with a decline in commodity prices and increased financial market volatility representing the most decisive risks. And with that, I thank you for watching this video.
Many thanks for that, Jörn. A lot of food for thought here. We will have a chance to revisit some of these points in the dialogue after the next two presentations. Now, we are very pleased to have with us Senior Advisor Lisetta Trebbi, former counselor at the Norwegian Embassy in Jakarta. She will share with us her perspective on the Indonesia CEB and developments in the countries. Please go ahead, Lisetta.
Brief for Indonesia offers an interesting oversight, background and context for donors and partners that are either thinking of entering into new development space in Indonesia. The Country Evaluation Brief for Indonesia offers an interesting oversight, background and context for donors and partners that are either thinking of entering into new development space in Indonesia or further develop its prior engagement in the country. It is in itself interesting to offers an interesting oversight, background and context for donors and partners that are either thinking of entering into new development space in Indonesia or further develop its prior engagement in the country. It is in itself interesting to get an easy access to evaluations carried out in the field that Norwegian aid is operating in. As I understand it, it has not been the purpose of this exercise to cover all aspects of the context that aid operates in. Nevertheless, it can be interesting to note a few additional issues that can enrich the understanding of the space this report is covering. I want to note something that is maybe obvious, yet very seldom talked about. Notably that government is not necessarily one united entity working in the same direction. In Indonesia, this is particularly true. Obtaining a balance between different interests is a cornerstone of Indonesian politics. This means that even when donors align with government priorities and interests, there is no guarantee that this direction in the end will succeed. Within government, there are many different interests represented, working in different directions. This is challenging the approach of aid used by donors and the likelihood of success of the intervention. This also means that decision-making follows other logics than Western donors are used to and understand from their home sphere. Donors with a long-term engagement in the country understand this well. But it is important to take this into account when assessing the success of an intervention, especially at a higher result level where a large effect on society is expected. There is also some issues that an evaluation brief like this is not able to capture. Though the brief shows positive results in the area of governance, such as strengthened participatory policy making, improved regional and local development planning, and in some cases better public service delivery, the methodology does not allow for showing how the same process has negatively impacted on the advancement in the area of environment and climate. It is well recognized today that decentralized authority over land use in Indonesia has enabled large-scale deforestation and climate change emissions, driven by local authorities. This is recognized by the national environmental authorities today, which is now re-centralizing the authority of land use to the national level. Furthermore, the geographical vastness of the country, the social and cultural diversity that exists in Indonesia, and the uneven distribution of resources greatly impacts on the space for donor engagement to succeed at a national scale. The great variety in local government capacity that exists today is not clearly coming out in the report. Lastly, it would be very, very interesting to see more closely how different approaches used to collaborate and deliver aid has impacted on the success. The report naturally cannot capture all this, and more in-depth analysis is needed to truly guide donor investments in the future.
Many thanks for that, Lisetta. Very interesting and useful perspectives for our later dialogue. Before that, we also have with us another person with deep insight into the situation in Indonesia, Sofie Schütte. Sofie is a senior researcher at the U4 Anti-Corruption Center at Michelsens Institutt. Sofie has spent several years in Indonesia and has written extensively on several relevant topics, including Indonesia's Anti-Corruption Commission work on the forestry sector. We are eager to hear your perspectives on the situation in Indonesia. Please, Sofie.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Norad on an important series that identifies, compiles, and analyzes evaluations from a diverse group of programs and giving them a second life. So many resources go into evaluations, and most of the findings, especially the less flattering ones, are only seen by a small number of people. Yet there is so much we can learn from failure and an analysis of why some things work and some things do not work. So I very much appreciate and applaud the work that has gone into excavating the reporting and making a selection for us. The country evaluation brief on Indonesia is based on a selection of 27 evaluations of 8 programs since 2013 and covers a wide range of topics and areas of donor support. Some main messages that I'm taking away reading this brief are that Indonesia has made considerable economic progress and is now a middle-level income country. Its former colonial power, the Netherlands, have notably ceased their ODA as of last year, and more partnerships agreements with a focus on trade are expected to replace traditional aid agreements. But the socio-economic inequalities have not decreased. And in fact, as the report points out, Indonesia has one of the fastest rates of fastest rising rates of inequality in Asia. And unfortunately, the report does not look into the reasons for that. The evaluations testify Indonesia strong national ownership of the reform agendas. And this is something I can confirm based on my personal impression working in Indonesia. Yet the sustainability of some of the interventions is not clear, partly due to the timing of the evaluations, which are typically right at the end of programming. Decentralization has happened long enough ago to allow for the positive assessment of the role that aid has played in its planning and design. But the brief also mentions that this has not always resulted in the improvement of service delivery. Decentralization is still suffering from a lack of coordination between the different levels of government and an uncertain legal and regulatory environment. I also take note of the brief's critique of donors, and unfortunately this is not surprising and not specific to Indonesia. There's a lack of scaling up of successful pilot projects, half-hearted gender mainstreaming, and generally missing strong success indicators and baselines, and unfortunately also often the unavailability of reporting. What I would have liked to read more about, even if this is missing in the individual evaluations, corruption and state capture would deserve stronger mention in the additional analysis. Anti-KKN, or anti-corruption, collusion and nepotism, was a crucial component of the reform and democratization movement in Indonesia. And it continues to get a lot of public attention and raises concern. Maybe it's by the nature of my daily work, and I'm a bit biased here, but I am missing corruption as an undermining factor of development results in this report. And also it link to abuse of power more generally. The brief testifies Indonesia a stable democratic system. However, experts of Indonesian politics observe a democratic decline and state capture by elites. Controversial populists from the opposition are now part of the cabinet, and the Brookings Institute recently commented on the president drawing increasingly on the military as a support base. Yes, Indonesia holds regular and free elections, but in application, its democracy has become increasingly illiberal. Its Freedom House score last year was only 61, or partly free. And the cited reasons for that are, again, systemic corruption, discrimination and violence against minority groups, the separatist tensions in the Papua region, and the politicized use of defamation and blasphemy laws. So my question for the way forward is that if ODA is making an exit from Indonesia because of its economic growth, and new bilateral and partnership agreements are increasingly focusing on trade, how are the growing inequalities going to be addressed? And how can governments from the West, the North, or the South, in the case of Australia, continue to bring civil liberties such as freedom of expression and the rights and treatments of minorities to the agenda?
Many thanks for that, Sophia. Several important insights here. We now have heard three different perspectives on the situation in Indonesia and international development assistance to the country. Let's now explore some of these issues further. And Jörn, Lisetta, and Sophia, we now start the dialogue. And I'd like to start with your question, Sophia. How can the growing equality going to be addressed? And Lisetta and Jörn, can you comment on that? First, Lisetta.
Thank you. That's a big question. And I think my first reflection is that it's not something that donors themselves can address. I mean, the growing inequalities have to be addressed by Indonesia, by the Indonesian society, by the government itself, and it has to be a will to put effort into addressing that. And I do think that there is a will to do that. However, what we can do as donors is we can support some of those processes. That is possible, but always in partnership with the country and where the country is going, not on ourselves. But there are very, very strong reform forces in Indonesia. There is both within civil society, within government, working together. So it's about what I was saying in my recorded video. It's about forming partnerships with the government who are working in directions that we jointly think are the right ways to go, but always for us as donors to respect and build on the directions that the government is taking, I think. Yeah.
Jörn, would you like to comment on the same question?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity of being able to present the CEB here today and be part of the discussion. I think the two comments are very well taken and address some extremely important points that are indeed to a large extent missing from the CEB. And I've been now involved with 11 of the 17 CEBs as team leader of the project and also as author of 2, including Indonesia, of course. And well, I think as authors, individual authors of the CEBs, we have always faced this challenge of really having to restrict ourselves to synthesizing the existing evaluation reports and not being able really to bring in our own expertise. I mean, I'm a political scientist who teaches Asian politics and development as my main job. So, of course, I would have loved to address the issues that have been raised. But unfortunately, and we have to ask ourselves also why, issues of, let's say, forest governance or corruption, as Sophie elaborated on, have not been extensively addressed by donors during the period we have looked at, or are not well covered in evaluation reports. But okay, this as a short introduction. Well, I share all the concerns that have been expressed, but maybe I tend to be slightly more optimistic. I mean, I've been following developments in Indonesia for 30 years now. My first trip to Indonesia dates back to '91, and I also lived in Indonesia for certain periods of time. So I've seen the Suharto times, the authoritarian period. I've seen the transition. I have evaluated many donor programs and projects in Indonesia. And I think the fact that, I mean, this might be setting the bar really low, but the fact that Indonesia is stable can be considered a democracy, despite the restrictions. That this is true. I mean, there have been some backlashes. There is a tendency of towards liberal expressions in the political system and so on. But seeing that Indonesia is stable, that unlike Myanmar, for example, the military has never returned to power, has never staged a coup, the fact that the current government is a populist one. Jokowi is a kind of a populist, but he's a technocratic populist. It's not that kind of aggressive or exclusionary, charisma-based populism that we are seeing elsewhere in the Philippines, Brazil, or under Trump in the United States previously. And well, the fact that Indonesia has always, since the transition, been able to manage really this thin line, this tightrope between a liberal democracy or aiming at a liberal democracy and defending the secular state, and having the hardline, the challenge of hardline Islamist movements. This is quite something, and it has worked quite well. I agree with everything that Sophie has said, but I would also argue that donors have done a very, very good job of strengthening approaches to governance at the local level in particular. They also have addressed corruption in the early phases since the transition, but unfortunately, and for reasons that we might have to look into, this has stopped. So I haven't seen, when I reviewed all these different reports, I haven't seen any major approaches to anti-government efforts and anti-corruption efforts anymore. So what I have certainly found out during this exercise is that the focus on governance that was very, very strong, let's say 15 or 10 years ago, is no longer really there anymore. And I think this is one of the weaknesses that we have seen in the donor support to Indonesia in recent years.
Thank you. Let's now move over to, you are right, Jörn, of course, this is not an individual evaluation. This is a synthesis of formal evaluations. So that's very important to emphasize. Let's move over to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Jörn, you said in your presentation that Indonesia is meeting its treaty obligations when regarding human health, chemicals, hazardous waste, and climate change. But what about the scaling up of such interventions? And as you said, Indonesia remains one of the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gases. How can Indonesia's partners support the country in scaling up efforts to halt deforestation and reduce emission levels?
Yeah, very important point. And unfortunately, the CEB again is a bit inconclusive on that. I would also like to second what Lisetta said, also very, very important, that we would have to look at governance approaches in the forest sector, generally in the climate change and adaptation sector, which is not covered by the evaluations. So there, of course, there have been and there are major projects and multi-million programs in this sector, but some donors are a bit tight-lipped about their efforts. Unfortunately, I have to be critical of my own country, Germany, here. Well, German Development Cooperation in general is not as transparent as many other OECD donors when it comes to publishing evaluation reports. And so I didn't have access to any reports, for example, related to the major GIZ projects that have been going on for several years, related to climate change, forestry, and also palm oil. So that's why there are not that many findings in the CEB on this sector, and this is really unfortunate. Just to mention in a positive sense, that I think that the Nordic countries are really a beacon of good practice by making basically all, including Norway, of course, all evaluation reports public. So I'm, to be honest with you, I'm not a climate change expert. So I don't really know what could be done. I think
so let's move over to Lisetta.
Yes.
You are more of a climate change expert. So please, Lisetta, can you comment on the same issue?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, I'm not sure when you say what can be done to be scaled up, because in that question, you sort of, what you are saying between the lines is that there are only small projects, pilots here and there that are not scaled up, and I would question that, particularly in looking at what Norway is doing, because Norway is doing the opposite. Norway is not doing a lot of small scale projects, which is again to this methodology. When you look at evaluations within singular projects, you of course you gain something because you can learn from those, but you also miss some other approaches, and I think Jörn has explained that very well, that's understood. Because Norway is working in a partnership model with the Indonesian authority at the highest level. So that is a big scale, and it's a big scale program. And unfortunately, with the timing of this report and this exercise, what has not come out as a huge success is that the deforestation rate in Indonesia is going down. And I think we should note that, yeah, because when we are starting to look at whether Indonesia is going to reduce its emissions, the biggest sector is land use. And when they manage to turn the curve and the deforestation is going down, you know, if it continues and if it continues to go substantially down, that will be a big contribution to reducing emissions. So I think that there are models that are at scale. Whether other donors want to follow that model is a different question. And then I also think that one has to look at what's happening in the energy sector. And in the energy sector, Norway is not as active and as a big donor. There are other donors that are in there. But of course, without addressing the second largest emitter in Indonesia, which is the energy sector, it is hard to, in total, to bring down the Indonesian emissions to a very, very low level.
Sophia, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, I must admit, I was a bit scared that you would ask me the question that I ask. And so because I've also been thinking about that, and maybe if I may respond to that at the same time, looking at the inequalities. And so one thing I think we need to keep in mind when looking at Indonesia as a middle income country, it's that its tax base is still very low. So the income that the state generates from collecting taxes, and it's actually lower than in Myanmar. It's less than 10% of the GDP. And in addressing inequalities, for Indonesia to be able to address inequalities, it would be important to raise actually its own tax base. And there is tremendous wealth in Indonesia as well. And so as an entry point for donors also to address the inequalities, it might mean moving away a bit from the national level, more towards the provinces where poverty rates are the highest. For example, in Papua, it's 7 times higher than in Western Java, and donors are already doing that. So really target going into the areas in Indonesia where the poverty levels are highest, and linking that to the problems that also have been pointed out. So this disconnect between national level and local level policies, and helping bridge that, and possibly then there are some technical assistance needed there.
Okay, but
now,
let me continue
to the forestry, yes, and to the to forestry and so I've actually done some work on this recently, looking at the corruption cases in the forestry sector. And what we see there is one problem is the law enforcement has improved. This is something that has been found also in the evaluations. So as corruption can undermine the efforts to stop deforestation, but what we find that while individuals have been successfully prosecuted, the big companies that are benefiting from deforestation, that are benefiting from getting the big mining contracts and doing irreparable damage to the land, they are not being prosecuted yet if they're breaking the law. And so far it's just been individuals. This is changing now, and I think this is an interesting thing to follow during the next years, in to what degree Indonesian law enforcement agencies will be able to follow up with the big companies that have been benefiting from the corrupt schemes in getting licenses in the forestry sector, but also in the mining the mining sector.
What I can hear from all three of you are that there are limits to what donors can do in a country with so populous and with so much wealth, so much inequality, like Indonesia. But one question, I start with you, Lisetta, is the country is now on its way to be a higher middle income country. Given that fact, is development assistance still a relevant tool for Norway's relation with Indonesia?
Yes, but it depends on how it's given. What is the modality? How do you enter a partner? How do you enter with aid? So is it through the very traditional ways that we are used to providing aid, project-based, a lot through, small community type of interventions that in themselves can be very, very helpful for the communities? Or is it more in a larger partnership where government has set its own targets for where they want to go, and those targets match with where we have our where we think that we can be useful and want to go? And in the case of Indonesia, it's like, if you look at the Indonesian forest, it's Indonesia's forest. They are managing their forest. It's just that these forests are also providing big benefits to the world. So Indonesia has an opportunity to provide big benefits to the world. If we can use aid in a sensible way, in a strong partnership with government to preserve these natural resources, for example, and this will go for other sectors as well, I do think that we have a role to play. But we certainly should look at our traditional project-based deliverables in countries like this, and it's about what is it we are trying to do? Are we entering into collaboration around policy shifts? And I think it's linked to your question about scaling up. It's like, where do you create actual impact? Do you create impact by going into small, relatively smaller project, for example, restoring land? Yeah, so you restore land, it's good in itself, but if the same type of land is being converted elsewhere, you don't really achieve impact at a higher level. And these are the things we need to start looking at I think in general in aid, not only in these countries.
Jörn, what do you think? Is the development assistance still a relevant tool for Norway in relation to Indonesia?
I think it is. I mean, Lisetta already mentioned the RED+ partnership, which is very important, but I think this is also the future of development cooperation in the area of the SDGs, where we should, of course, go beyond. Everyone is expected to go beyond traditional donor-recipient partnerships, and we all carry the future of our planet in our hands, regardless of whether we are in the north or in the global south. And RED+, I think, is a good example for a global partnership, and this also relates to climate change, forest programs in general. I think really it's important to provide assistance to Indonesia in this regard, but it's also important to definitely move beyond traditional ODA relationships, and I think this is accepted. There is no doubt about that. But I think there's also often a misunderstanding that transforming aid partnerships means automatically focusing only on trade and investment. This is part of the story, but it's not the only one. I mean, a partnership entails also addressing the challenges that rise in the context of global trade and investment, and all the contradictions that we already mentioned it in some regard that exist and emerge when you invest in the energy sector, when you invest in palm oil and so on, need to be resolved. And a very important part of this is also policy dialogue. And I think that future ongoing relationship with Indonesia, and this also applies to other countries as well, obviously, I think has to be even more strongly embedded in policy dialogues. So in terms of the actors that are involved, the stakeholders that are involved, I think it's important to broaden the existing dialogues.
What about you, Sophia? Do you believe still in the Norwegian development assistance to Indonesia?
I would broaden it to development assistance, generally bilateral assistance, maybe not just Norway. And I can see that the projects have changed. One thing I observe is often now you have a lot more Indonesians actually in leading positions in the development support programs. Which, because you have so much expertise in Indonesia, it's sometimes the role of bilateral partners is more in facilitating and pinpointing to particular issues that maybe otherwise would not get the attention. And this is where I think there remains a big, yeah, maybe not responsibility, but I do see somehow also a possible role for bilateral partners to engage on the more uncomfortable discussions, and maybe also as part of trade talks and these policy dialogues when it comes to human rights and when it comes to the treatment of minorities, because otherwise I'm not quite sure who's going to take it up. We also I think one thing that was noted in the CEB was that initially a lot of the funding after with the beginning of the democratization, a lot of donor support went to civil societies, and this has declined. And maybe this is something also that needs to be scaled up again, is the support to civil society organizations, to legal aid organizations that can support minorities. So in a way also making sure that that those aspects are still covered and supported. Another aspect and another entry point perhaps is also at the more at the regional level and international level, where there are international fora and associations that where some of these values could be pointed out and supported. I'm thinking of ASEAN here, for example, and I noted that the EU has been doing that, engaging at the ASEAN level, but that reporting on that wasn't yet available to be covered in the CEB brief. So I think also at this, in the regional fora, international fora, there's also an entry point for bilateral donors, development partners, to bring up the more uncomfortable discussions.
Let me continue with you, Sophia. There are so many serious problems mentioned here: increase in inequality, illiberal tendencies, state capture, corruption, gender-based violence. Can more emphasis on civil society do something?
So Indonesia has a very outspoken civil society and many NGOs, many of them are now 20 years old with a lot of experience. There's a first generational overturn, and so there is actually a lot of capacity in civil society that could be supported. Yes, so there, I think there is a lot of capacity on the ground that could be supported, that might need funding, and that might also maybe need benefit from being brought in touch, in connection with international discourse, inviting them along to international conferences so they can connect with other civil society. These are things that are already being done. And one thing I observed now now that we all have to stay at home and have to link up by computer virtually, I find that I see myself more often invited now to discussions in Indonesia because it's become so cost effective, and actually there's no cost for Indonesian NGOs now to invite experts from overseas to talk at their events. So in that regard, maybe the whole pandemic has also had one small positive effect.
We are about to conclude, but I would like to hear Lisetta's respond to all these serious problems in Indonesia. If more support to civil society can be a kind of a solution to that. And I also would like Jörn to comment on the same.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, yes, I mean, civil society plays a very important role, for sure. I do think that civil society certainly is part of Norway's aid portfolio in Indonesia, quite large part of it, both in terms of funding, in terms of collaboration, in terms of, having civil society work with the government as well, as many of them do. I mean, civil society in Indonesia are often contributing to the reform work inside of government, drafting up of new laws, etc. And I think all this is something that we are supporting today. I do think that there isn't like one solution. It's more how you multiply, how you do work well with the government, how also on the difficult issues, like Norway has worked quite a lot with the law enforcement agencies, with the anti-corruption agency, very well known, and it's possible to do that in if you do it in the right way, and of course not only work with civil society, but work across the whole society, so that there is support from different angles. I think that is probably the best strategy.
Jörn?
Yes, I think one of the reasons why Indonesia is often presented as a success story, keeping in mind that there also have been authoritarian and illiberal tendencies, that's for sure, is that Indonesia has always had a very strong and vivid civil society. And this made Indonesia also different from other countries which entered a transition phase from authoritarian to democratic rule. So donors did not have, in a way, to create NGOs first that they could fund afterwards. Cambodia would be such an example where this happened. But you already had a very active civil society with very strong visions about the future, and this has continued. And so donors came in to support local initiatives, national initiatives that were carried by NGOs, by the civil society in general. And this has worked very well. I think there are few examples in Asia, maybe in the world, that have been as successful as Indonesia in terms of civil society ownership of certain development agendas. The good thing about Indonesia is also that the civil society was never aid dependent, unlike in other countries, again, also including Southeast Asia, which has given civil society more freedom actually to promote their own ideas, being supported by donors, but not driven by donor interests. I don't know to what extent, again, a traditional form of supporting NGOs should or can continue, whether it is really necessary to do that. As Sofie already mentioned, ASEAN, and what we see there as well is that NGO networks, transnational networks have grown, also putting pressure on governments, not just in Indonesia, but in the whole region, to address the more sensitive issues of corruption, human rights, inequalities, and so on. And we see the effects and we see the positive results of that. But what I think is important that schemes are available, but which doesn't have to be maybe direct support for a certain NGO in Indonesia, but schemes are available maybe via research institutes, via NGOs in Europe itself, via regional organizations in Southeast Asia, to provide a framework for these NGOs to operate and to also provide funding schemes to which these organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations in general can apply to. So this would also be a certain change in the philosophy of providing support to the civil society sector, away from the direct support to specific NGOs, but more towards general funding schemes that NGOs can apply to, because they have the capacity to do so.
I have a final question that I want all three of you to give a very brief answer to. If you are optimistic or pessimistic when it comes to Indonesia's democracy, if we now see a decline into authoritarianism, optimistic or pessimistic? Start with you, Jörn, and be brief now.
I'm optimistic. The government enjoys a high level of legitimacy. There is trust in the political institutions that is important. Indonesia will always, for the foreseeable future, face the challenge of balancing pluralism with more fundamentalist tendencies. It has worked. I wouldn't exclude some authoritarian regression, but generally I'm optimistic.
Okay, fine. Sophia, what about you?
Despite the reporting that may cause me worries, I'm optimistic because I know so many Indonesians who are true Democrats at heart. So, but this is just intuitively, I'm optimistic here. Okay,
so 2 or 3 are optimistic. What about you, Lisetta?
It has to be 3 or 3 then. So I'm also optimistic. I agree with Jörn's point. I think it is hard for us coming from the societies we do who work so differently. This balancing act at all times in the Indonesian society, it means that it can look a little bit scary for us in our perspective sometimes, but I do think that they are keeping on the right track. So I remain optimistic.
Okay, then we end this on a happy note, and I leave the floor over to Jan Petter.
That was absolutely wonderful to hear, also at the very end. Thank you so much from me to you all. The country evaluation brief for Indonesia has been forwarded to the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, together with the other CEBs. In the cover letter, the evaluation department recommends that the CEBs be included as part of the knowledge basis for the current and future Norwegian development assistance. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to report author Jörn Dosch and the team from Particip for producing an excellent report, and to Jörn for his presentation today of the main evaluation findings. I also thank Lisetta Trebbi and Sofie Schütte for adding very important perspectives during today's webinar, and to all of you who have been with us today. Eventually, we hope that the Indonesia CB and the other reports will be useful for you in your development work. Warm thanks also to my project partner, Kristin Helge, my colleague, Kjersti Løken, and acting evaluation director, Siv Lillestøl, during that period, for invaluable support throughout this project. I'm also pleased to have with us Norad's new knowledge and evaluation director, Håvard Mokleiv Nygaard, who started in his new position last week. The Indonesia webinar is the last one scheduled. We hope you find useful the 17 CEBs and accompanying evaluation portraits we have produced so far, and that our efforts to make evaluation-based knowledge about international assistance to these 17 countries accessible, and that it will constitute a positive contribution to your work to support development in these countries. Many thanks to you all.